The Louisiana sun blazed overhead, casting heat waves off the polished chrome of newly assembled vehicles and the freshly poured concrete of the sprawling Hyundai facility. It was a site tailor-made for the new era of American industrial resurgence, a South Korean automotive giant planting deeper roots in U.S. soil, and President Donald Trump standing at the heart of it all like a living monument to economic nationalism. The crowd, workers in coveralls, families with MAGA hats, local officials with broad smiles, roared as Trump approached the podium. Cameras clicked in rapid fire, flags flapped in the breeze. It was equal parts campaign rally, policy announcement, and triumphal moment. This, Trump declared, the mic catching the full weight of his voice, is what happens when America wins again. He gestured grandly to the plant, the workers, the future. Hyundai is investing here, creating jobs, because they know we mean business. Applause thundered. Behind him, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent nodded approvingly, though even he didn't know what was coming next. Then Trump paused, a flicker in his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. The neatly prepared script in his hand was folded and dropped to the lectern like an afterthought. The president was going off script. "And speaking of business," he said, his voice dropping a register, suddenly more deliberate, more dangerous. "We've been playing nice for far too long. We've allowed countries to take advantage of us, to bleed us dry. That ends now." The applause gave way to a murmur, electric, anticipatory. Even Bessent, usually unshakable, stiffened slightly. Trump leaned into the moment. "Today I'm announcing a new tariff package. It's bold, it's necessary, and it's going to level the playing field for you, the American worker." He paused to let the words land. "We're targeting 3 sectors: automobiles, lumber, and semiconductors." Gasps and cheers mingled in the air like static. Then came the hammer. "I'm calling it reciprocal justice," Trump said, his tone razor sharp. "And it starts with the dirty 15. 15 countries with the most egregious trade surpluses and the highest barriers against American goods. You've seen the charts. You've lived the consequences. From now on, if they hit us with tariffs, we hit them back harder." The crowd roared again, patriotic fervor ignited by righteous economics. A worker in a red hat held up a handmade sign. "Made in America" means jobs in America. Markets initially surged on the announcement, optimism driven by promises of domestic manufacturing growth and repatriated capital. Stocks in steel, industrial equipment, and shipping spiked. Conservative media hailed it as the bold economic stroke America had been waiting for. But in global capitals from Brussels to Beijing, the mood turned grim. Trade envoys canceled planned vacations. Emergency meetings were convened. In Berlin, the German finance minister held an unplanned press conference calling for urgent diplomacy. In Tokyo, murmurs of retaliatory measures began to percolate. The World Trade Organization issued a carefully worded statement expressing deep concern over the potential for destabilizing protectionism. Back in Washington, analysts scrambled to dissect the fallout. Critics warned of potential price hikes and diplomatic blowback. Allies whispered unease over being lumped into the dirty 15. But Trump's team was ready. Charts, figures, and economic justifications flooded the airwaves, bolstered by a media blitz from Treasury, Commerce, and Doji economists. The message was clear. We tried fair. Now it's time for fair and tough. And Trump? He left the podium with a smile that said he knew exactly what he was doing. The gloves were off. The trade war had entered a new phase, one defined not by spreadsheets, but by sovereignty. For America's factories and foreign ministries alike, the message was unmistakable. The rules had changed, and Trump was writing them. Inside the austere, red-walled sanctum of Zhongnanhai, the nerve center of Chinese power, President Xi Jinping stood before a towering flat screen, arms folded behind his back, face carved from stone. The air in the room was still, heavy with tension. President Trump's fiery announcement from the Hyundai plant in Louisiana was now playing on every major Chinese network, subtitled and looped. The words "dirty 15," "reciprocal justice," and "semiconductors" hung in the air like daggers. Behind Xi, a semicircle of high-ranking advisors, ministers from finance, foreign affairs, and industry, stood in silent formation, their expressions unreadable, but their anxiety unmistakable. President Xi broke the silence with a single low sentence. "This is more than rhetoric," he said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "Trump is serious. The semiconductor tariffs, they are a direct attack." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The gravity of the moment spoke for itself. Semiconductor exports were China's soft underbelly, a cornerstone of its ambitions to dominate global tech, and a sector already under strain from US-led restrictions. Trump's escalation wasn't just symbolic, it was surgical. Xi turned slowly to his Minister of Commerce, Gao Feng, a veteran of countless trade negotiations, now standing with his hands tightly clasped. Xi's gaze locked onto him. "Prepare a response," he ordered. "A measured response for now, but make it clear, we will not be bullied." Gao bowed slightly, then disappeared into the depths of the compound. What followed was like the ignition of a great invisible engine. The vast machinery of China's economic statecraft began to shift into motion. Within hours, China's State Council convened an emergency session. Targets were identified: key U.S. agricultural exports, aircraft components, and rare earth supply contracts. Simultaneously, Chinese cyber units were placed on high alert, their directives updated with new retaliatory priority tiers: market destabilization, economic espionage, and digital disinformation. State media outlets, with precision orchestration, began circulating editorials decrying American unilateralism and accusing Washington of resurrecting imperialist aggression through tariffs. Diplomats across Europe and the Global South were mobilized to lobby against the U.S. campaign, framing China as a defender of a fair and rules-based international trade system. But behind the scenes, in the deeper recesses of Zhongnanhai, a second phase was already being drafted. Internal briefings floated terms like asymmetric reprisal, strategic decoupling acceleration, and selective pressure on U.S. supply chains. Xi understood Trump better than most Western leaders. He knew this was not mere performance, it was leverage, hard, brutal leverage, and if not countered, it would embolden further escalations. The economic conflict had just entered a new chapter, one not defined by spreadsheets, but by steel, sovereignty, and the willingness of two giants to test how far the other would go before blinking. The measured response was coming, but China too was playing the long game, and now the world was watching two titans gear up for a global confrontation, not of bombs, but of balance sheets. A trade war on the surface, an ideological showdown underneath. The age of polite diplomacy was over. The dragon had been provoked. Now it was beginning to coil. In Ottawa, the corridors of power at Parliament Hill buzzed with confusion and growing panic. Prime Minister Mark Carney, just months into his new tenure, stood before a rapidly assembling war room of ministers, advisors, and national security officials, his jaw tight as he read the breaking alert on his tablet. President Trump, without warning, had just slapped a sweeping 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum. The justification was blunt and unmistakably Trumpian: Canadian non-compliance on fentanyl trafficking enforcement. Carney, a former central banker praised for his globalist polish and technocratic poise, had promised a new era, one of cooperative North American diplomacy and resetting relations after years of Trudeau-era tension. Now, with the Canadian dollar plummeting and Quebec steel mills already threatening layoffs, that promise lay in ruins. "This is a political hit," Carney muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not about trade, it's about power." Behind him, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland shook her head gravely. "And we didn't see it coming." Carney was in crisis. His softer approach, heralded by progressive media just weeks ago, now looked dangerously naive. His own caucus, restless and deeply split between traditional liberals and economic nationalists, began murmuring about leadership weakness. Protesters gathered outside the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa. Editorials in The Globe and Mail shifted from congratulatory to critical almost overnight. And in a quiet estate just outside Montreal, Justin Trudeau watched it all unfold with the wry satisfaction of a man who'd once been publicly humiliated by Trump, and now saw a path to reclaim relevance. Though officially retired from politics, Trudeau remained a force within the Liberal Party, a donor magnet, a celebrity figure, and to some, a ghost haunting Carney's new administration. The news of the tariffs lit something in him. He dialed Carney directly, bypassing protocols and staff. "I heard about the tariffs," he said, his tone measured but unmistakably smug. "Let me offer you some informal advice." Carney, frustrated but desperate, listened. Trudeau spoke carefully, offering strategies that felt less like policy and more like political chess. Pressure U.S. labor unions connected to the steel industry, file aggressive WTO countersuits to stall implementation, and most pointedly, begin quietly building backdoor alliances with European leaders and state-level U.S. governors hostile to Trump's trade doctrine. But beneath the civility, Carney could sense it. Trudeau wasn't just being helpful, he was maneuvering. His language was too precise, too rehearsed. This wasn't about helping Canada weather a trade crisis. This was about Justin Trudeau, about legacy, about revenge, and about reinserting himself into a geopolitical game he was once burned by. Carney, savvy in his own right, recognized the offer for what it was, both a lifeline and a trap. Still, with domestic pressure mounting and the White House refusing to take his calls, Carney weighed the costs of isolation. Trudeau, for all his flaws, knew how to navigate Trump's brand of disruption, if only from the bruises he bore. In the shadows of Canadian power, two prime ministers, one active, one spectral, now danced a delicate duet, with the fate of Canada's economy and its future on the North American stage hanging in the balance. Trump had thrown the first punch. Carney now had to decide whether to play diplomat or fighter. And Trudeau, he was already sharpening the knife. Inside the White House, the Situation Room had been reborn, not as a crisis response hub, but as a forward-operating war room. Maps of trade routes, currency flows, and commodity charts covered the digital walls. Lines of code flickered on oversized displays. Dossiers of foreign economic ministers and corporate power players scrolled on secure terminals. It was not a battlefield of bombs and bullets. It was spreadsheets, sanctions, and sovereign leverage. And at its helm were two of the administration's most potent weapons, Scott Bessent and Kevin Hassett. Bessent, sharp, unflappable, with decades of Wall Street cunning behind his crisp demeanor, paced slowly, his hand cupped around a mug of black coffee. "We need to be surgical," he said, his tone clinical. "Targeted tariffs, high-yield strikes, designed to inflict maximum pain on supply chains, investor sentiment, and strategic exports, while avoiding unnecessary blowback on U.S. consumers." He tapped a glowing touchscreen with the precision of a surgeon. Currency manipulators, state-backed exporters, and sectors with narrow global margins, we hit them where it hurts. Across the table, Kevin Hassett leaned in, surrounded by data models and historical precedent. A longtime believer in free markets, he had once advocated for restraint, but the numbers had changed. The world had changed. "The data is clear," he said, tapping a printout of comparative trade deficits. "For decades, these countries have played by a different set of rules: massive subsidies, state ownership, currency games. We've been the only ones playing fair in a rigged tournament. It's time to level the playing field." The room nodded. Around them, a small army of specialists worked around the clock. Data scientists ran real-time simulations of tariff impacts across dozens of sectors. Trade lawyers dissected every treaty, clause, and loophole. DOGE's intelligence analysts monitored encrypted foreign chatter, flagging signs of capital flight, strategic reserves being repositioned, and adversaries meeting behind closed doors. The goal wasn't just punitive, it was psychological. The administration's strategy was to sow uncertainty in foreign capitals, to make governments think twice before challenging America's economic dominance. This wasn't globalism. This was economic statecraft, cold, calculated, relentless. The April 2nd deadline loomed like a sword. That would be the day the administration unveiled the Reciprocal Trade Framework, a sweeping plan to implement a graduated tariff scale targeting 15 countries, the infamous Dirty 15, based on the size of their trade surplus and the restrictiveness of their domestic markets. The list was bipartisan poison and populist gold: China, Vietnam, Germany, India, South Korea, and more. Each nation would be offered a bilateral renegotiation window. Comply, and the tariff would be delayed. Refuse, and the full penalty would be applied, escalating quarterly. "We're not out to destroy the global order," Bessent reminded the room. "We're here to reset it, on our terms." Trump, briefed personally each evening, was thrilled by the theater of it all. But he was more thrilled by the numbers: manufacturing ticking up, energy prices stabilizing, stock market volatility slowly settling as investors bet on American resilience. Hassett closed the session with a final, quiet reminder: we don't need a trade war. We need a trade revolution, and this time, we write the rules. April 2nd would be more than a policy moment. It would be an economic doctrine, Trump Doctrine 2.0, and the world would have no choice but to listen. The operation had been airtight, or so they thought. But as April 2nd drew near, the internal pressure inside the Trump administration's economic war room began to mount, and fissures formed where once there had been discipline. The first crack came from Detroit. A leaked internal memo from the U.S. Trade Representative's office revealed that executives from major American automakers, Ford, GM, and Stellantis, had been quietly lobbying against the upcoming auto tariffs. They feared that the 25% import duties on foreign-made vehicles and components, particularly those sourced from Canada, Mexico, and South Korea, would trigger immediate price hikes. Consumer backlash, they warned, could tank Q2 sales and cost tens of thousands of jobs in swing states. Their message was clear: don't make us collateral damage in your global chess match. Then came Big Pharma. Pharmaceutical lobbyists, long masters of navigating transatlantic regulatory corridors, began pulling strings on Capitol Hill. Their firms relied heavily on trade protections with the EU and Canada, where cross-border research collaboration and supply chains were essential. They whispered into the ears of influential lawmakers: Trump's policies will cripple medical innovation, spike drug prices, and alienate allies we need for next-gen biomedical development. And those whispers turned into murmurs in subcommittee chambers. But it was the leak that changed everything. Suddenly, confidential draft documents from the USTR's tariff negotiation strategy, full of unreleased country-by-country escalation models and pressure points, began appearing in major international outlets. Le Monde, Der Spiegel, the Financial Times, all published coordinated exposés within hours of each other. The documents were precise, detailed, and damning. Not only did they outline the tariff structure, but they included contingency plans, revealing which industries the administration considered acceptable collateral and how much economic pain each partner nation could tolerate before capitulating. The global market recoiled. The Dow dropped 1,200 points in 36 hours. European and Asian indexes followed. Panic, not in the White House, but in the C-suites of global corporations, took hold. The narrative rapidly began to shift, from one of confident American assertiveness to one of overreach and recklessness. Inside the White House, suspicion ran rampant. The leaker had to be high-level, someone with deep access and political motive. Within hours, Acting Chief of Staff Andrew Kloster initiated a counterintelligence sweep. By midnight, suspicion had already narrowed on a senior USTR official, a career bureaucrat who had grown increasingly vocal about protecting the global trade framework. The working theory: this wasn't a whistleblower, this was sabotage, a deliberate attempt to tank the stock market, fracture Trump's negotiating posture, and force the White House to retreat under political and economic pressure. And just as Trump's team scrambled to contain the fallout, Canada moved. Mark Carney, sensing the moment with the instincts of a veteran central banker and a savvy globalist, launched a full-spectrum public diplomacy blitz. In press conferences from Ottawa to Davos to CNN International, Carney framed Trump's policies not as strategic recalibration, but as economic isolationism dressed in patriotism. He warned of the unraveling of the global trade order, painting Trump's moves as reckless, destabilizing, and contrary to the values of the post-Wu Western alliance. He appeared alongside European leaders, hosted a town hall with American economists who opposed the tariffs, and published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that described the Trump doctrine as a high-stakes experiment in unilateralism doomed to trigger retaliation, fragmentation, and ultimately stagnation. It landed with precision. Wall Street analysts began urging caution. Moderate Republican senators, already under pressure from donors and industry, publicly wavered. The Heritage Foundation issued a carefully worded statement supporting the administration's intent, but urging greater flexibility in application. Inside the White House, Trump was furious, but focused. "They think they can bleed me out," he told Besson and Hassett. Well, they just reminded America who has really been running this town. The clock ticked toward April 2nd. The president faced a pivotal choice: double down in the face of coordinated resistance, or recalibrate. The world held its breath. The next move would define everything. Trump didn't blink. He never did. While the global media speculated about a White House in retreat, while the D.C., Elite whispered about a backpedal, and while diplomats abroad quietly celebrated a supposed crack in the America First doctrine, Trump prepared to hit back, not with apologies, but with ammunition. At 8 p.m. Eastern, in a hastily announced and widely anticipated address titled America First, Fair and Final, President Donald Trump strode into the White House's East Room, flanked by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Senior Economic Advisor Kevin Hassett. Behind him, a massive LED display glowed with real-time economic data and historical trade statistics. The nation tuned in, Wall Street, Main Street, Brussels, Beijing, and Ottawa, all watching. Trump wasted no time. For decades, he began, his voice firm, the American worker has been sacrificed on the altar of globalism. While factories closed, while families struggled, our leaders signed sweetheart deals that made foreign elites rich and left our towns in ruin. He gestured toward the screen, which shifted to stark, irrefutable charts. Hassett stepped forward, breaking down the numbers with surgical clarity, multi-billion-dollar trade surpluses from foreign nations, suspiciously unbalanced agreements, and lopsided tariff regimes that undercut American industries. Then Bessent followed, unveiling, for the first time, a declassified summary of internal reviews from past administrations, exposing just how deeply previous negotiators had conceded ground in the name of global cooperation. The figures were damning. The anger was palpable. Then came the challenge. I say this to our trading partners, Trump declared, staring directly into the camera. You are welcome to the table. But if you choose to keep robbing the American people, if you choose to protect your tariffs and close your markets while flooding ours, then you will face the full weight of American trade power. No more one-sided deals. No more excuses. The speech was more than a defense. It was a call to arms, a public declaration that the economic order of the past was being burned down and rebuilt brick by brick, steel by steel, job by job. And something extraordinary happened. Across the Midwest, in the Rust Belt towns of Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, where shuttered plants had long been left to rust, the response was electric. Mayors of small towns issued statements of support. Blue-collar workers flooded message boards and talk radio with calls to hold the line. For the first time in years, they felt seen, heard, and, most importantly, defended. Even Wall Street, initially shaken by the leaks and diplomatic uncertainty, began to stabilize. The markets bounced back. Domestic manufacturing stocks surged. Chip and auto sectors rebounded, bolstered by confidence that the administration would secure real concessions. And one by one, the world blinked. Behind closed doors, foreign governments that had initially condemned Trump's tariffs began sending quiet overtures to Washington. Trade envoys reached out to U.S. counterparts. The Prime Minister of Japan dispatched a private letter requesting a renegotiation framework. Germany signaled it was open to recalibrating its auto tariff structure. Even Carney in Canada, while still publicly critical, floated back-channel talks about sector-specific exemptions. But the biggest shock came from Beijing. Facing domestic economic pressure, a slowing export market, and rising political tension, China offered its first real concessions on semiconductor exports. For years, Beijing had kept tight control over rare earth minerals and chip supply lines, using them as a geopolitical shield. But now, under the looming threat of targeted American tariffs and global investor flight, they blinked. They proposed an agreement, increased chip export quotas to U.S. manufacturers, transparency in industrial subsidies, and a joint task force to resolve disputes over supply chain manipulation. It wasn't unconditional surrender, but it was a win, a massive one. Trump, when briefed, simply nodded. We don't need to crush them, he said to Bessent. We just need to make them respect us again. America First, Fair and Final, had done more than stabilize a volatile situation. It had reaffirmed Trump's grip on the narrative, the economy, and the future of global trade. The era of appeasement was over. Reciprocity wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was policy. It was doctrine. And the world had just learned that Trump wasn't bluffing. The political reckoning came for Prime Minister Mark Carney like a tidal wave cresting over Ottawa, silent at first, then devastating. Days before Trump's long-anticipated April 2nd announcement, a trove of leaked internal Canadian government documents surfaced via the National Post and syndicated across global media. The contents were explosive. The documents revealed that Carney, despite his carefully cultivated image as a responsible globalist reformer, had personally intervened to shield a series of timber export contracts tied to powerful political donors and party insiders. The contracts, according to internal analysis, were not only economically inefficient, but actively harmful to Canada's broader trade position with the United States, undermining Carney's already fraying credibility on the international stage. The revelation shattered Carney's carefully maintained narrative. Overnight, his messaging on Trump's tariffs as economic isolationism dressed in patriotism collapsed under the weight of hypocrisy. Editorials across Canada turned brutal. The Globe and Mail ran with Prime Minister Carney's double game, politics over policy. In Washington, Trump's advisors smiled quietly behind closed doors. Then came the day of reckoning. On April 2nd, with the world's eyes once again fixed on the East Room of the White House, President Donald Trump stood before a podium flanked by American flags and economic advisors. He held a slim black folder containing the final version of the Reciprocal Tariff Order, a document that would be remembered as the definitive end to decades of trade policy inertia. Today, Trump said, his voice steady, unmistakably presidential, we are enforcing reciprocal tariffs on just 7 nations from the Dirty 15. These countries have declined to meet our requests for fair and open negotiation. They chose confrontation. We choose accountability. Behind him, Bessent and Hassett stood resolute. But let me be clear, Trump continued. To the rest of the countries on that list, including some of our oldest allies, we're not slamming the door. We're opening it. Trade summits will be held over the next 60 days. This is their chance to do what's right, to negotiate new fair deals with the United States. If they choose cooperation, they'll find America ready. If they don't, they'll face the full strength of American trade enforcement. It was a surgical strike, precise, targeted, and deeply strategic. By applying tariffs to just 7 countries, those who had dug in, refused dialogue, or attempted sabotage, Trump demonstrated restraint without weakness, strength without recklessness. It gave the others an off-ramp, an opportunity to save face and rebuild their relationships with the U.S. on a new foundation. And the global response was instantaneous. Markets stabilized, then surged. Foreign leaders who had once resisted now scrambled to join the negotiation queue. European finance ministers publicly denounced Trump, but privately reached out to U.S. counterparts. Japan sent an immediate diplomatic envoy. Even Carney, wounded and politically cornered, dispatched his trade minister to Washington within 48 hours to request a bilateral summit, hoping to salvage what was left of his international standing. This wasn't just a moment of victory for Trump, it was a reassertion of sovereign power in an era dominated by transnational bureaucracies, toothless treaties, and endless capitulations. In a world long addicted to consensus for consensus's sake, Trump had refused to play by the old rulebook. He'd written his own. And he'd won. April 2nd became a turning point, not just in trade policy, but in the psychology of global diplomacy. The United States had redrawn the lines. And for the first time in a generation, the world was adjusting to America's terms. The age of managed decline was over. The sovereign resurgence had begun. And Trump stood once again at the center of the storm, unchallenged, unyielding, and unmistakably in command.